In the quiet twilight of a late afternoon, there is a sadness that arrives unannounced, creeping into the silent house. You sit there, staring at a phone screen that never rings, feeling the pale streaks of sunlight stretching across the wooden floor. No tragedy has occurred, nor is there any physical pain screaming for attention. Yet, deep within you, a change that is difficult to name is gradually making itself felt. Many people mistakenly believe that the greatest challenge of old age is declining health or aching joints, but the truth is often much quieter than that. The deepest pains do not reside in medical records, but in the invisible losses of the soul. These are the nameless griefs, undiagnosed and rarely spoken aloud, even though millions of elderly people carry them silently every single day. At some moment in the midst of ordinary days, a question arises from within: where do I belong now? Buddhist wisdom teaches us that impermanence touches everything, from our roles to our very sense of value. In this video, we will look into the 8 silent griefs of aging that the world seldom mentions, not to sink further into sorrow, but to understand, to give them a name, and to gently let go of that heavy burden. Grief. 1. The quiet disappearance of being needed. Think back to a time in your life when you were the center of every connection. It was those early mornings when your children waited at the door to ask for your advice before starting their day. It was when colleagues could not make a major decision without your consultation. You never demanded or fought for that role. Life simply placed you there, and you devotedly carried it year after year. The feeling of being needed is not a small thing. It is the red thread that weaves the meaning of life, affirming that you are important and that your presence makes a difference to this world. However, over time, that thread begins to thin without warning. Your children grow up, they build their own families and have their own ways of solving problems. At your old workplace, younger people have taken over the system and run everything smoothly without your intervention. Discussions still happen, plans are still executed, but your name no longer appears in those conversations. One afternoon, you suddenly realize it has been months since anyone sought your advice. It is not because they are heartless, but because the wheel of life has quietly reorganized itself around your absence. There is a tightening pain in the chest that very few dare to utter. I miss feeling useful. We often hide this because we fear appearing selfish or clinging to power. But this is a very human pain. Buddhist wisdom points out that suffering arises when we cling to temporary roles that the laws of nature have retired. You are not that title, nor are you that job. You are the pure awareness observing the change. Look at the image of a majestic mountain. The mountain does not build, produce, or solve any trouble, yet no one doubts its value. Its still presence brings a quiet power. Old age is just like that. You have lived long enough to become a presence that cools the atmosphere in a room. Instead of agonizing over the question, "What can I still do?" gently ask yourself, "What kind of peaceful presence can I be?" Grief 2. Watching the world move faster without you. Visualize a very familiar situation during family meals or festive gatherings. You are sitting among your loved ones, especially the younger members, and you realize the flow of conversation is rushing past you like a swift current that you cannot step into. They mention unfamiliar names, brand new phone applications, or social trends you have never heard of. You still maintain a smile, nodding and taking a sip of tea to appear natural. But deep down, a painful realization arises that you are no longer fluent in the language of this world. This sense of displacement does not come from a sudden event, but happens gradually, like a tide receding so slowly that you do not even notice until you look down and see the water is already far from the shore. This is not merely a technology gap or information obsolescence, but the feeling of being left behind by a world that you yourself helped to build. Devices change, methods of communication change, and even the way people measure value shifts constantly, without ever asking if you can keep up. Faced with this overwhelm, many older people choose to withdraw, speaking less, and gradually retreating into their own world of familiar things. This is not stubbornness, but a kind of mental exhaustion from feeling like you no longer belong to the contemporary rhythm of life. However, Buddhist philosophy offers a comforting perspective that speed has never been synonymous with the depth of awareness. Reflect on the metaphor shared by Zen master Ajahn Chah. A turbulent, rushing river can only reflect its own chaos, while a still lake can perfectly reflect the beauty of the moon above. The world outside may be racing at breakneck speed, but that acceleration often comes at the price of superficiality and forgetfulness. Old age grants you a capacity that youth has yet to attain, which is the ability to look through the surface of all things, to see the unchanging laws of the human condition. You are not lagging behind, you are simply becoming more still to reflect the substantive values that those who are in a hurry have not yet realized. The world is moving fast, let it flow on, because you are in a different position, where presence is more precious than agility. Grief 3. The gradual shrinking of the world around you. In the years of youth, life is like a vast and endless field with horizons expanding in every direction. You look ahead and see countless unformed possibilities, new friendships waiting to be discovered, and distant lands that your feet long to reach. Back then, the future was not a fixed destination, but a constantly shifting horizon, inviting you to explore different versions of yourself. That sense of vastness is a precious gift of youth that we rarely recognize until reality begins to undergo silent but resolute changes. Over time, the radius of daily life begins to contract without any formal announcement. A close friend moves to another city, and the thread of contact gradually thins until it snaps. Another friend falls ill, no longer having the strength to join you in old habits. Most heartbreaking of all is when someone departs forever, taking with them an entire chapter of shared history that only the two of you understood. Long journeys that were once easy now require meticulous preparation and longer recovery times. The abundant energy of the past must now be spent as cautiously as the last coins in a long journey. The body that once carried you across the world now begins to set conditions, demanding more rest and care than ever before. The vast world of yesterday now shrinks down to a familiar armchair, a window overlooking a small garden, or a short walk along the old neighborhood. There is a sadness that accumulates quietly, like a layer of dust on a table, which only becomes noticeable when examined closely. Sometimes, an inner voice whispers that your life is fading and the most brilliant chapters are left behind. However, Buddhist philosophy approaches this sorrow with a profound observation on the nature of depth. When the outer world shrinks, it creates the ideal conditions for the inner world to expand. Like a well, the purest and most abundant water does not lie on the broad surface, but in the deep depths beneath the ground. The story of the Zen master who spent 20 years just observing a plum tree in the temple courtyard teaches us that this is not confinement, but a completely different kind of attention. Old age gives you the opportunity to truly be present with a cup of tea, to feel the sunlight moving across the room, and to understand the universe contained within each present moment. The shrinking of physical space is actually an invitation for you to explore the fulfillment within your soul, something that you accidentally missed during those past hurried years. Grief 4. The loneliness no one talks about. There is a bitter truth that we very rarely dare to admit publicly. You may be living in a complete family, surrounded by children and grandchildren, receiving devoted care from those who love you. Yet deep in your heart, you still feel an agonizing loneliness to the core. This is not the type of loneliness of an empty house or a physical absence that can be fixed by a phone call or a visitor. It is a much quieter, more complex, and far more difficult state of mind to endure, precisely because there is no obvious reason for others to understand it for you. Imagine a cozy family dinner where the room is filled with light and the laughter of children. Everything from the outside looks perfect, like a picture of happiness. But you realize the stories circling the table seem unable to reach you. Concerns about careers, anxieties about social media, or the new terminology of the younger generation make you feel like a stranger listening to reports from a distant country you have never set foot in. You still sit there, still smiling and nodding at the right time, but your presence is merely a formality. You clearly feel the loneliness of being in a room, yet not truly being met by anyone, still being seen yet becoming invisible. This loneliness is often hidden because we fear becoming ungrateful for the affection of our relatives. However, Buddhist wisdom views this experience through a completely different lens. The Buddha once mentioned the concept of noble solitude, a state that is not about isolation or being abandoned, but the ability to be at ease when alone with one's own mind. When the noise from the outside world gradually recedes and social roles no longer weigh heavily, it is not a punishment, but a sincere invitation. It is the opportunity for you to truly meet the real person who has been waiting all this time behind the masks of usefulness. The solitude you feel in the middle of a crowd is actually evidence of an inner depth accumulated over many decades. Instead of running away from that terrifying silence, try stepping into it as if returning to your own home. The observations, reflections, and wisdom you possess are things that those superficial conversations could never contain. When you stop seeking external validation, you will realize that this silence is the very space for you to connect most deeply with the true nature of life. Grief 5. The weight of memories within the soul. Everything can come rushing back at a perfectly ordinary moment of the day when you are completely unprepared. An old melody plays on the radio, a familiar scent of food wafts by, or simply as you walk past an old street corner. Instantly, the surrounding reality seems to vanish, and you are pulled back into the past with a strange vividness. You hear a voice that no longer exists in this world, feel the warmth of a kitchen from decades ago, and when those sounds fade, you realize with a start that you are still sitting alone in a quiet room with a heavy feeling in your chest that has no specific name. For young people, the past is merely a resource they occasionally visit, but for the elderly, the past becomes a country they carry with them everywhere and at all times. This land of memory grows more crowded, more vibrant, and sometimes more distinct than the present itself. However, not everything we carry is brightly colored. There are memories so heavy they are difficult to acknowledge. An argument that ended a relationship that was never mended, angry words that cannot be taken back, or a moment when someone needed you but you were not there. Those mistakes silently accumulate, forming a weight upon your shoulders and making your breath shallower every time you remember. Buddhist wisdom faces this pain with a very practical lesson about the two arrows. The first arrow is what actually happened in the past, the losses or mistakes that we cannot change. The Buddha never asks us to deny the pain from this arrow, but the second arrow is how we shoot ourselves by constantly reenacting, agonizing, and asking what-if questions for a story that ended long ago. The first arrow causes the wound, but it is the second arrow that prevents that wound from closing. The weight of memory is not meant to punish you, but is an invitation to practice letting go. You do not need to forget or pretend that things never happened, but rather to recognize the difference between the lesson the memory brings and the suffering created by the mind. The past has molded who you are, granting you compassion and patience. When you understand that you have finished the lesson of that moment, you have every right to set down the heavy bag of memories to walk lightly in the present. Memory should be a guiding teacher rather than a shackle restraining your soul. Grief 6. Becoming invisible in a youth-focused world. Take a moment to observe how public spaces operate around us. You will see that attention often automatically gravitates toward the young, the dynamic individuals, or those at the peak of their success. The gaze of the crowd, the media, and even the allure of advertisements all point in a single direction, the movement and ambition of the future. In that flow, older people sometimes feel themselves gradually becoming a faint background in the vibrant painting of life. This is not the result of an act of malice or intentional cruelty, but simply because modern culture has defaulted to celebrating youth, radiant beauty, and the ability to create immediate material value. This feeling of being pushed to the sidelines can cause silent yet profound wounds. It is when you enthusiastically tell a story from your own hard-earned experience, but receive only indifferent glances or a quick silence before the conversation shifts to another trendy topic. It is when your opinion is no longer listened to with its inherent respect, but is viewed only as a minimum courtesy before being forgotten. You sit at a dinner table or in a meeting and feel that although your body is still present, your status has become a part of history instead of a factor of the present. This pain truly exists, and it deserves to be acknowledged sincerely rather than being covered up by hollow words of comfort. However, Buddhist philosophy brings an unexpectedly reversed perspective on this state of invisibility. The Buddha preached extensively about the burden of the ego that desires to be seen. Throughout our lives, we have spent too much energy building a perfect personal image for the purpose of being admired, chosen, and validated. When the world stops observing you, a magical kind of freedom emerges. You no longer have to perform. This uninvited invisibility suddenly becomes a liberation from the grip of the ego. You are no longer dominated by what others think of you, or forced to try to maintain your appeal in the eyes of those around you. When you let go of the need to be the center of attention, you reach a state that Zen master Shunryu Suzuki called the equanimity of a person who is nobody. At this very moment, you become the person capable of the clearest observation in the room. Because you are not busy expressing yourself, you can listen more deeply to the unspoken pains of others, see the details that the young are too rushed to notice, and be present most authentically with reality. This is not a weakness, but a kind of quiet power, a profound wisdom that only those who have passed through the noisy stage of self-assertion can reach. Grief 7. The awareness that time is limited. One morning you wake up, and as you look at the streaks of sunlight filtering through the door, you suddenly realize an obvious yet shocking truth that time is not an infinite treasure. There is a strange moment when the number of your age is no longer a measure of growth, but becomes a signal reminding you of the journey's end. When we are young, we live with a deluded sense that time is a resource so abundant it will never run out. We always have words like later, next year, or someday to postpone dreams or important meetings. The mind back then always believes that the door to the future will remain open forever, and that we have every opportunity to correct every mistake or start over from the beginning. However, as we enter the twilight years, those words begin to lose their weight. Instead of looking toward distant plans, you start to ask a direct and haunting question. How much time do I actually have left? This question may initially carry a bitter aftertaste of fear and regret, making your heart tighten when thinking about things not yet completed. But if you look deeper, this is not at all a negative or pessimistic thought. In fact, facing finitude squarely is the very lamp that illuminates the most core values of life that we often accidentally forget during the years spent chasing fame, fortune, or fleeting illusions. Buddhist wisdom regards this awareness as one of the most important practices to achieve liberation, called maranasati, meaning mindfulness of death, or contemplation on impermanence. The Buddha did not teach us to contemplate death, to cause fear or depression, but to help us learn how to live more fully and deeply in every present breath. When you accept that everything is dissolving moment by moment, you will no longer waste energy on meaningless arguments, old grudges, or anxieties about a future you cannot control. You begin to recognize the preciousness of a peaceful breath, a loved one's smile, or the beauty of a newly bloomed flower. The true meaning of old age lies in the fact that you are granted a special lens to see through the fog of busyness. Knowing that time is limited does not make life meaningless. On the contrary, it makes every moment more sacred and cherished than ever before. You learn how to prioritize what truly brings peace to the soul instead of flashy external things. It is the awareness of finitude that has helped you transform sadness into a deep appreciation for life, turning each remaining day into a festival of mindful presence and sincere gratitude. Grief. 8. Letting go of the person you once were. At a random moment as you stand before the mirror to start your new day, you suddenly pause a little longer to observe the reflection before your eyes. You still recognize those familiar features, your eyes, and your own smile. But there is an undeniable truth that this face no longer resembles the person you have long remembered in your mind. The wrinkles at the corners of your eyes, the skin no longer overflowing with vitality, or the hair that has turned gray are all traces of time telling the story of a long journey. The sadness that arises now is not because of the fading of physical beauty, but because you realize you must say goodbye to the youthful, energetic, and enthusiastic version of yourself that you were once so proud of. The greatest loss of old age is sometimes not the parting with loved ones or the changes in the world around you, but the feeling of losing your own former self. You remember the time when you could run for kilometers without feeling tired, the ability to work through the night, or the sharpness in every important decision. Having to accept a body that is slowing down and a mind that needs more rest brings a kind of silent sorrow, much like having to bid farewell to a best friend who has accompanied you for half a lifetime. You struggle to find ways to keep the fragments of the past. But the reality of impermanence always reminds you that everything has shifted to a completely different chapter. Buddhist wisdom views this change through a profound lens of liberation via the teaching of non-self. The Buddha taught that the self is not a fixed entity or an immutable object over time, but in fact, it is a continuous process of arising and ceasing. The you of 20 years old, full of dreams, is far different from the you of 40, full of responsibility. And that version is even less like the quiet person you are at this present moment. If we forever cling to an old image from the past, we will create a prison of suffering and regret for ourselves, preventing us from experiencing the beauty of the current stage. Every stage in a person's life is a necessary version to mold the wisdom you possess today. This transformation is not a process of loss, but in essence, a refinement. When the glitz of youth and the ambitions of self-assertion gradually fall away, what remains is the truest and deepest essence of the soul. You have not lost yourself at all. You are simply shedding the shells that are no longer suitable to become a more quintessential, calmer, and more compassionate entity. Letting go of the old version is the bravest act so that you can welcome the wise person existing right now. All the silent griefs we have just walked through do not imply that life in its twilight years has become meaningless or empty. On the contrary, the fact that you can clearly feel those invisible losses is a testament to a life lived fully and with great depth. Each pain is a hyphen between what has passed and the spiritual maturity you are currently attaining. If youth brings us constant movement and burning ambitions to assert ourselves, then old age bestows a much more precious gift: absolute stillness, clarity of perception, and a vast well of wisdom. True peace in these years does not come from trying to be noticed by others, the feeling of being needed, or the effort to chase after an ever-changing world. It comes from your courage to accept and be fully present with your own life right here and now. When the noise fades away, you will find that you have never been alone, for you have found your way back to self-contained serenity.